Hello, welcome to the National Gallery. My name is Jennifer Slifka. I'm one of the two curators of the current exhibition, Monochrome Painting in Black and White, together with Lelia Packer, who is floating in the audience somewhere. If you haven't had the chance to see the show yet, I hope you will. If you've seen it or if you've seen the catalogue, you know that you go do a kind of whistle-stop tour through 700 years of history of painting in black and white. And you end in Oliver's amazing immersive light installation called Room for One Colour, and I'm delighted he agreed to lend it. I thought it would be a beautiful kind of epilogue or coda to this entire history of painting in black and white. All of a sudden you're in a monochrome world. You may not know that he also contributed to the catalogue. There's a beautiful essay at the very end of the catalogue called Your Monochrome Listening. Kind of a nice synesthesia there about looking and hearing that I think encapsulates a lot of the ideas of the exhibition, a lot of the topics that you've dealt with in your work over the years. For those of you who haven't read that essay yet, I just thought I'd say a couple words about it, and then I think that sets us up nicely for the kind of topics that we'll probably talk about through the next 30, 40 minutes, and then Oliver has very kindly agreed to take questions at the end. Well, too late now, I've said it, so you have to. What's really nice about the essay that you include in the catalogue, I think, is that you remind us of the great breadth of subjects that you dealt with so far, that you continue to deal with. And one of the major ones, like ones that we're all familiar with probably in this room, is the idea of the senses and sensory experience and perception, specifically color, light, but also the haptic experience, the idea of touching, how important that is. I was familiar with your interest in space and architecture and all that sort of thing, but I learned two really important things which I didn't know that you're interested in, that I think is, one of them is very pertinent for us here at the National Gallery, and that's how much you've been involved in the years in the role of, or thinking or rethinking the role of the museum and the gallery space, and how that can be a site for different kinds of experience, social interaction. You talk about seeing yourself seeing, which is really great for this exhibition. I thought I'd start with two slides. You are known very well around the world, but I think in England and in this city in particular, you're probably best known for this installation at Tate and for this installation in the Serpentine Gallery. So I thought we could start maybe with Tate. I was also curious to just quickly ask the audience, if you don't mind, how many of you, just by a show of hands, saw the weather project at Tate? So a good high percentage. Apparently visited by over 2 million. That's an staggering number. Will you talk us a little bit through what we actually saw?
It's so first of all, thank you for a kind introduction, Jennifer, and thank you for spending your Friday night here with us.
You're staying all night.
But I think at the Tate, one of the things which you mentioned that I was interested in was the fact that at the time, maybe more so, the Turbine Hall was almost sort of a buffer between what was outside, which is what we call public space, and what was then inside the museum or the sort of cultural institution. And that transitional space had the opportunity, and I mean now it has a legacy and it draws it more into a certain fixed role, but then at the time Tate was not quite as established, and the program in the Turbine Hall was less so established, so it had the opportunity to act as a different agent or as a different type of it had a different type of hospitality, I would argue. I'm not saying it's not hospitable now, but it had still a degree of freshness which would allow for, should I say, a different kind of engagement. So what I was interested in was to give the space back to the people from the perspective of the cultural institutions. So I worked a lot with, and I talked to the architects, I talked to the sort of staff at the museum. How do we trust and give back the space to people? How do we allow them to occupy it? And obviously I wouldn't say that I was preparing for what then actually happened, because the truth is I didn't know, and it was also very unexpected. But I was very interested in this notion of hospitality, because I think it has a lot to do with telling the audience that you actually trust them. And obviously that's not very easy in the first place, because you are, by all means, just like the National Gallery, you are a robust sort of a hierarchy that sits on the notion of what is truth and what is not truth, in terms of history, for instance. So to tell people you trust them is also a little bit like accepting that, well, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe the institution is not always right. And so that was the outset. And then it became more pragmatic from that point. And that was more about, well, how do I show nothing? Or at least just show the space. So one of the first ideas was to, the show actually started with making weather phenomena. So, I mean, the first draft for the exhibition was to do rain, snow, cold, wind, all kind, like sort of a meteorological encyclopedia, all the weathers. And from Denmark, we always, where I lived at the time, no, I lived in Germany, but coming out of Denmark or Scandinavia, we always said that the British, they talk a lot about the weather, if not only. And so anyway, so I thought, okay, the weather project, that must be a definite success. I would make people love it.
And give them light.
But also I think it had a few potentials, such as the idea of, the nature in the city, which was very much about the relativity of how we perceive the city. I mean, the nature would be the rendering of the hospitality of the city space. So public space and weather is somehow the nature that is left in us on one side. And on the other side, it also, I do think that the weather, talking about the weather, actually offers the hospitality or the opportunity to share the fact that we might not agree. So you say, oh, I really like it when it's like this drizzling rain. I go like, oh, I hate it. And we can still be together. So the kind of the kind of weather topic is a social framework in which we can disagree without having to be friendly or unfriendly to each other, right?
It's very English. That's how so many English conversations
so it's interesting comparing to where the world is now. I was nurturing, clearly very unsuccessfully, so I was nurturing the fact that people would actually host the other or the disagreeing and still have a success. I mean, being different and be together, and also be together. And that is obviously, that is a lot of social theory in terms of public space, and what does public, when you say public space, actually mean. It actually obviously has to do with sharing something without necessarily having to agree. That's why we put street, traffic lights, so that, we help people to agree on what is right and wrong. And the architects, Herzog de Meuron at the Tate, they were good friends, or they are good friends of mine, and so they are also very interested in being Swiss and all of that, in sort of micro democratic activities on street level and so on. So that's how the show actually. And I forgot to say the pragmatics that were, how do I only show the space? And that's where the idea for just doing a big mirror, saying, okay, let's not put a sculpture. Obviously, the year before there was another very large red sculpture, which was very much about the objecthood as such, and the gravitational.
Anish Kapoor.
The gravitational qualities in that. And then, so I thought I would absolutely not do that. Of course, then I will do the exact opposite by sort of removing or dematerializing and so on. And then so on it went.
I'll just remind people, and for the two of you that didn't get a chance to see it, the mirrors are on the ceiling.
Yes, so just in all fairness, I thought you looked so young when I came in. I said, oh, nobody have seen it. So happy. Some of you must have been kids when you went with the school, clearly. But essentially it's half a round disc under a mirror. So for the ones of us who walk in like this, like the camera person here, it looks like a full disc. So the other disc was the kind of illusion of a circle. And if you made the effort to go to the rear end of the room, you could actually see it from behind. I mean, see the rear side. And interestingly, you would actually see the exact same lamps, so much for innovation, that is here at the National Gallery. So the light in this room is the light that is actually used here. It is monochromatic.
Sodium lamps.
Yeah, and it's a low energy. It was developed for high sort of highway, in Switzerland, Belgium, you have these yellow light tunnels, highways, and so on. So it has a lot of energy. No, it uses little energy with a lot of light. So all the light goes into one frequency, so you see a lot, except you don't waste light on seeing all the other colors. That is why it's called monofrequent light.
No time wasted on all the other colors. I love it. And also that also explains why all the figures lying on the, well, first of all, why they're lying on the floor. They're looking at their own reflection. They're appreciating, or you can look on the screen here, but they are watching themselves in their own experience, which is kind of extraordinary.
Yeah, but I think it's a little, there's an element in this, they're watching themselves in the context of other people experiencing themselves. So you're sort of having a third person point of view on your own activity, which allows you to say, maybe I'm actually being brilliant now, or maybe I'm actually being really not so brilliant, right? So it has a small mirror in our domestic space would be a much more about the subjectivity and so on. But a big mirror like that actually becomes more about the construction or the constitutional systems of what is a space capable of.
And you could see what everyone was doing around you. And what's extraordinary about that also is, you may remember, I don't think anyone's doing it here, but people started spelling out words and making forms, and so that they were sort of bringing themselves together in order to kind of create something different in that response.
In that sense, it brought attention to that the fact that the movements we have or how we use cultural institutions are in fact to a large degree submitted to social control in terms of social, how are you going to sit down on the floor in one of the galleries here, or are you not? Probably you might actually, it might do you some good to take your time and sit down on the floor and look at a painting, but probably you will feel, oh, I'm desynchronizing from the social norm. I'm not going to sit down on the floor. If anything, I'm going to sit on a bench. I'm definitely not going to lay down.
Sit on a bench, actually.
Yeah. No, so the exposure of the social norms or the kind of power structures of how we monitor each other and how we behave, and there is a very strict behavioral system according to which you experience art the right way and how you're not supposed to experience art. So here in this case, there was a lovely Donald Judd show up on the 3rd or 4th floor, and people up in the Donald Judd show, they started sitting down on the floor, which I'm sure Donald would have loved, and knowing his work, right? So then, of course, immediately the fire people said, you can't sit, because then if people are going to run, then we only can have 8 people in the gallery instead of 8 of 80, and that's not very good for business and so on. So so the whole idea of how we behave is actually quite complex. But I mean, also, all of this is easy to say afterwards, but it's interesting to also think about what does hospitality in cultural institutions then actually mean? How do we nurture the intimacy that is needed to look at a painting? Maybe laying down, I'm not sure, but I'm just saying maybe reevaluating how we behave and behave to each other also, and what social and collective construction is actually supporting in an amplifying way the experience, and what social structure is actually counterproductive to the intimacy we would want to experience with a painting.
Didn't you, I wonder if this is connected to some of the projects you did, a project with the Hirshhorn and possibly with the Smithsonian as well, where you were thinking about how people move through this space, how they engage with the artworks, the app that you created for the K20 in Dusseldorf, that you can kind of do your own self-guided tour. You're really thinking about how people use that space, how to get them interacting in new, different ways.
Yeah, but so there is a small, very nerdy part of me that is obsessed with what is, I think, called museological methodology or display theory. How do we create the confidence or the exchange rate that is productive for both the painting? Think of a painting here who's been traveling several hundred years to meet you on that late afternoon where you come for work and you come to see the painting. So it's like 2 trajectories meeting. It's like quite incredible. Several hundred, maybe from the 15th century, a painting's been on a journey, right? Totally busy all the time, wars, everything's going through, and you come from work, and it's like, and suddenly you are there, right? So if you think of it, it's actually really quite amazing, and somebody made the effort to build a building like this around it to make sure that the hospitality of that meeting is actually as generous as possible. So looking at it from that perspective, we really owe it to the painting and to you to find out what is the most productive situation here. How can we make the most of this incredible, I mean, who knew that painting would travel all those centuries to meet you and greet you in this way? So there is so much stuff there, which obviously is struggling a bit with you bringing your bloody phone and being all out of focus, thinking about your kids at home and being totally disconnected from this moment, and the painting being inscribed in a whole social system, art historical hegemony, non-negotiable kind of a power posture where the painting just says, this is about me, right? So there's not a very friendly, it's very
and
often
the label
not,
says,
yeah, and you
this is about the curator.
yeah, so, and obviously it takes some stamina and self-confidence for the viewer to dismantle that kind of system where you suddenly say, oh my God, I've been looking to see not just the painting, but to reflect my not yet verbalized emotional need by the virtue of that painting. That painting is in fact reflecting something that I've been working on. I haven't quite sorted it out. Just like a book, a theater play, music, a great concert, so it suddenly tells you, yes, this is who I am. This is why I went to this gallery, because I wanted not to see the painting, I wanted the painting to see me. I wanted the painting to acknowledge that I have been on a journey too. And I actually feel generally in my everyday life, nobody's listening to me. And finally the painting is in fact listening to me. That's why that title came from, that essay in the book, The Listening, because I think what a work of art does when it's successful, it actually creates a contract in which you feel it is seeing you. So the Weather Project obviously was very much about that, and the mirror and all of that. But so generally, that's a very productive sense of hospitality, because it offers you to leave the institution with a feeling of saying, well, maybe I'm not so stupid after all. You know, maybe I'm actually okay. I understand this painting. It is also understanding me, and I'm actually worthwhile. I'm a worthwhile participant in society as such. I'm not going to be marginalized. I'm not going to, vote in the wrong direction. I'm actually totally important, and my voice makes a difference. So being listened to, and the role of cultural institutions as such, I think is something that is really worthwhile investigating.
And you dig deeper. And I was so intrigued to hear more about this app that you made for the K20, because it was for an abstract minimalist exhibition that was primarily white paintings, wasn't it? It was Malevich, Kandinsky, Mondrian, and you, I didn't do the app myself, but if I understand correctly, you gave scenarios to the users of this app, and one of them, very provocatively, was, what does it pass in front of this painting as if you were an asteroid?
Oh yeah, so obviously I had to, I mean, one could, so it was an app, so you download an app and then you have it on your phone, and as you're gonna wear your phone, you walk with your phone anyway through the museum, might as well try to make the most of it. So we had these apps which were like a kind of a guide, and it was interesting because the K21, Marion Ackermann, who's now in Dresden, took over the job of Hartwig Fischer, who's now here in London. Marion had the idea, let's see if we can do something to make this highly abstract and really interesting show with, for instance, Malevich, more, if not accessible, then at least somehow negotiable. So it's not just that these iconic paintings on the wall and you say, my God, a black square on a white background, and so on and so forth.
No, you say, my goodness, black square.
And obviously, so the app really has to do with the empowering confidence in the fact that the user has something to say too. For instance, pretending to be an asteroid, someone drifting through the exhibition like out of outer space, where the normal contracts, I mean, being an asteroid, you're pretty, obviously you're on a trajectory, but you're not struggling with the kind of neoclassicistic sort of agenda that you have to face when walking into a building like this one, for instance, right? So it's very liberating to say, okay, today I'm an asteroid. I'm just going to float, and I'm just going to go that direction. And then the Malevich and the Mondrians, they're just going to be like this, and I see them in the passing. And the idea was that this exercises also a relationship with temporality, because the Malevich is not really now and before and after. It's just like now, all the time, right? So it was really a kind of, maybe a phenomenological idea of that time is not just like a kind of regime in which now is more important than what is coming, what is after. So it had this contemplative idea, as you can think when you say asteroid. It has this idea of, okay, let's drift. Let's disempower the rules. Let's be a little more focused on what is actually going on when I walk. Am I moving, or am I? So I mean, I'm not saying it was very successful, because it was really funny also, but still there was an agenda which had to do with these power-related structures that are in the way we see art in institutions.
I think it's nice also to have that freedom to let a particular artwork pull you across the room. And I don't know if you do this, but I love watching people in galleries. You know, do they just read the label and move right on? Do they go Rembrandt, 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 someone I don't know, Rembrandt, or, you know, how do they move? Do they spend 2 seconds on the painting? Do they just go straight to the gift shop? And you can learn a lot. And then if you're sort of giving them these cues, like just let whatever come to you, spend 10 minutes on one painting and no time on anything else. It's a different kind of engagement, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think we owe it to people to also assist them and nudge them in the kind of comfort of having to take a stronger stand with regards to what are people actually capable of making out of something highly abstract or Rembrandt or not so known artist. And obviously it might take a few visits to a museum, but as we have a relationship to people in countries like Britain, at least already at school when kids, and you know, so we could start with a pedagogical and so gradually, I mean, by the time they are 20, I think they have typically been forced into an institution. So at that point, we should have trained them to say, okay, it is me and who are gonna make the narrative that is relevant for me. I might be assisted by Rembrandt, by the curator, by the, you know, the strategy in general and so on, but to bring about that kind of self-confidence where you go to the museum not as a consumer but as a producer is something that does take, I think that has incredible potential. And we also just need to say, well, the not so sophisticated looking at art is also somehow a success. Maybe not the biggest success, but we need to prevent the kind of situation where we, without even thinking about it, we kind of have a stigmatizing relationship with the people we think are not so serious when they look at art. So we need to say to the people who went through and say, oh my God, it was really boring, you have to say, you are so welcome anyway, right? Or the people who say, oh, I feel really that I'm too stupid to come to the museum, you are probably a more important visitor than the person who feels really smart. So that also, so there's a lot we can do extending our, should I say, active hospitality in being inclusive and saying to people, even though you just don't get anything, you are totally and utterly important and welcome. And that actually does require a little bit of sort of soul searching, because it's not so easy to be nice to people who you think are really, it's a really uphill struggle with them. And
it's not easy being the intimidated one, where you just think, I'm going to be found out. I don't know anything about anything, and someone's going to point their finger at me and point out.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't mean to generalize too much. Obviously, we should not undermine science being over fluffy like overcooked noodles. But still, I still think I mean, considering the world, we owe it to the people who feel a little alienated by culture to actively take them in, because they are the more likely people to be our opponent tomorrow.
We should at least have a second slide. I was struck by how much of a collaborator you are actually, working in particular with architects, but also engineers, scientists, choreographers. We also know you here, as you mentioned, Herzog and de Meuron, but also with an architect that I can't pronounce his name, so I'll let you, the Norwegian architect with whom you collaborated on the Serpentine.
Yeah, it's Kjetil Thorsen, who has, with a few partners, the office called Snøhetta, who has in the meantime, maybe not because of this, but maybe because of this, they are now very successful. I mean, they were kind of successful before already. But so the Serpentine Pavilion was interesting because it was a one foot in the architecture world, and I'm obviously always happy to have a foot out of my own comfort zone. And Kjetil is a good friend also, so it was an opportunity to see him more often. I mean, the different experiments I make in architecture, they come out of my artistic practice, which has to do with spatial experiments. Spatial experiments both in material and form and how to build and do things, but also very much spatial experiments in why we do, or why we create it. Why does this space look like this? Instead of saying, okay, how do we make a nice room like this? And in that sense, Kjetil and I think the Serpentine program as a sort of institutional project has a similar agenda, both to be about why, but also, of course, be about how if they want to succeed. So
Isn't this a particularly nice combination for you? I mean, feel free to disagree, obviously, but because you think about nature and the elements and the outdoors, and often your installations bring the outdoors indoors, so suddenly there's a waterfall indoors or a rainbow or what have you. Because of the Serpentine Pavilions, because of the nature of that space and the kind of reciprocity between that, the permeability of those spaces, did this feel quite different in that you were bringing, kind of marrying two of your, or many of your interests?
No, it was. That's exactly how I felt.
Okay, on the next slide then.
No, but it's true. I mean, first of all, it's obviously great to be in London and to be in the park in the city in Serpentine. So it was all very interesting. It's still, there's a lot of British code and red tape and blue tape, and so that was a nice exercise too, to go through the struggle of having to also raise the money and all that. So an amazing team working behind it, and in that over-rationalized regime, you have to make something poetic also. So I love architects because they are so schizophrenic, because on one hand they have to please the client all the time, and all that whole bunch of very compromising relationships, and then on the other side they also have to make a point, make a statement, be focused on why they're doing it, and so on. So it's a great, I really treasure architecture, because I mean, artists can be maybe often more radical, but they are in the safe and comfort-driven environment of the protection of people like you and the institutions, the museums, the White Cube. And in that sense, it's admirable that somebody dares to take on aesthetical, ethical, moral, not that all architects do, I mean, sadly not, but so it's interesting to see. So it's a very inspiring field. I came to architecture, first I was interested in landscape architecture, very much because of painting and Renaissance and the whole role of landscape in the shaping of space. I went from that to theater, to urban theory, city planning. So from city planning, being a Scandinavian kid, I was very interested in how Scandinavian city planning and social agency and cohesion became a part of spatial theory. And that is how I became a more spatially motivated, with a bit of dance on top of that, which was street dance, right? So now I'm actually the one I thought I would. No, but do you see what I'm saying? So in a sense that was actually, and so the architect, in that long history of spatial agents, there's the architect, right? I mean, it's been along all the way, but for me that was where I ended. And now I have, with my former studio director, I founded an architectural office in my studio office. So I have, with a partner, former studio member, an architecture, and it's just for legislative, and because he's actually brilliant, so it's a bit unfair to take the credit for everything when it is actually architectural projects. So there's a few elements, but to build architecture, you need to be, because of unions and legislative. So I am actually certified. Should anybody need a building, I am certified.
You can have an Alison design building.
Who knows with Brexit? I might not. There might be an issue there, but if
you're building in Copenhagen,
if we hurry up.
Oh, brilliant! Okay, quick.
It's not my
Catch
specialty.
him after this talk. I'm aware that we built it. I admit that I only saw this 2 days ago for the first time, the real thing. I was walking through Reykjavik, and this kind of shimmering building just caught my eye in the corner as I was rushing to lunch, late as usual. It's an extraordinary thing. You've collaborated with architects. When you're working on the facade of a concert hall, do you take anything else into consideration? I mean, the site is extraordinary. I don't know if you can see, if you haven't been there in person, you're on the water. You've got all of the mountain ranges and volcanoes in the background. Do you have that? You're in the heart of Reykjavik.
It's kind of blocking the view a little bit.
It's blocking the view.
It's so nice there. It was so nice before.
That's what I was getting to.
No, it's open on both sides, but it frames the view, we call it.
Yes.
No, so yeah, no, I think it was a situation where there was a competition in several phases, in 5 phases, and already in the second phase, there was like the missing ingredient, and that's when they came to me, and it's fantastic, great Danish architectural office in big competition, lots of few British architects too, and then this was at the time a private project, maybe not the favorite Icelanders, but these before the crash type of quite active financial sector people from Iceland that you got acquainted with. So essentially they said, let's do a concert hall like this, like easy. And then they brought me in, and it was great. I said, okay, I'll do the visible part. The architects can do the invisible part. I do the facade. exterior, roof, everything on the outside.
The skin, as it were.
And the architects, to be honest, were also better. I mean, so it's, you know, it's complex to get all the, you know, all the corridors and toilets and all that. So that's also important, right? So, and that's how we got started. It was really an amazing project. And then, of course, there was the crash right in the middle of it. So luckily, my bill was paid, and but all the parquet, all the wooden floors, all the doors was just scrapped. So, as much as people were celebrating the fact that this was gonna be the tombstone of the Icelandic arrogant financial sector, it actually turned out, because they couldn't import the, you know, Brazilian floors, they couldn't get the gold handles from wherever, and they couldn't get the Polish steel, and they had to buy it all in Iceland. And as there was a total crash, total crash in economy, unemployment beyond belief, suddenly the only job to get was to build this bloody building, which people of course hated at the time. But then you know, somehow the kind of emergency signs, they were done by the local smiths, and somehow it became the one project where there was still a bit of money left to build it through, and the city pushed it, and it went from being a private sector, I mean, like highly, like neoliberal private sector, it became like a private public, and then it became a public sector project. So it was just a very interesting journey, and not so not just interesting artistically, but just it's also very much how does a society which is very small navigate a slightly oversized concert hall compared to the size of the society, and all of that, and so on and so forth. And you know, Iceland, even though they're small, they love, like the football team, they just love to be big regardless of the size of the country, and all of that. So in many ways this became a very emotional project. And the facade, as you can see, has a reference to a geometrical kind of mathematical system, which is about space filling crystalline structures, that a friend of mine who was a geometrician called Einar Thorstein had developed a lot earlier in my studio, and then we took it within the studio team and we took it into a further development, and it turned out to be a very beautiful relationship between science, mathematics, and construction and engineering and so on. And I don't want to go into details, but there is no columns. So the wall is holding up the roof, and that saved us. So there's that whole dimension in it, that it's not, you know, when architects call an artist, they say, I kind of have that difficult area, I can't really sort it out, can you just throw in some colorful or monochrome, you know, something. So then it's kind of, then the client won't see it. But so here we actually became a part of the structural system. And as an artist, even though this is not the front row news, as an artist, it's very exciting to be a part of what actually holds the building together, and not just something that is added on later in the process.
But you often also expose, I mean, so let's say in the Turbine Hall, we're convinced at first that we're looking at a full sun or moon or what have you, but you're also quite interested in allowing people to see the mechanisms behind their experience. So you could go up and see the hoses that were sort of emitting mist in the Turbine Hall, or you could go and look at the sodium lamps and see how it was actually done. And part of that kind of revealing aspect seems to be present in your other works, when you can, at first you think you're walking through a rainbow or a mist, and then you actually get close and you see it's a spotlight on, you know, moving water and that sort of thing.
I think it's important. And I mean, I try to encourage to have a kind of an element of the projects and the artworks that I do, where should people bother to look, they can see how it is made. I mean, and I don't, you know, when I was younger I said that's really important. Now I think it's relatively important, because I think it's very important that people know I'm not trying to pull their leg, and it's not about magic, it's not about illusion. Sometimes a small illusion, you know, somehow where you go like,
how is that done? Yeah.
But then if you bother to do like this, and you here in this exhibition, you see, oh, these bulbs must be monochromatic. It's probably some kind of light. I get it. Then you can get back to actually experiencing it. Sometimes when you have a light and you don't know where's the light coming from, then you spend all the time saying, how do they do this?
You're missing the point slightly.
Why is it illuminated but there is no source of light? Which would be very easy. An architect would do it in a second, right? And then you never actually get to the point on focusing on, well, what is my sense? Who am I? Why am I here? And all of these questions. And that I think goes for architecture too. So I of course like the architects who doesn't build, you know, who doesn't underestimate people's intelligence.
So you leave that architecture visible, the skeleton or the
Yes.
the
You
support
also shouldn't leave
structures.
too much, because then it's like, oh, people really don't get it, right? So it has to be like a well-balanced sort of dimension of not being pulled.
I added these slides to Olafur's because, as I mentioned, I've just been to Iceland, and I have to say, after being there, I see your sort of long-term study of volcanoes, these close-ups. The landscape actually is very monochrome. I was surprised by, especially all that black lava rock and black sand. You've done a whole series of waterfalls, and these ones more recently of the glaciers.
I posted this on Instagram today. It's funny you show them, this one.
So
Because
topical.
it's the COP, 20, what is that, 23 now, 22? In the Bonn, the small island state climate meeting. That's today, these days. So I actually have it on because of that. But yeah, this is great.
Actually, you also post photographs of how these photographs were taken, which is extraordinary. You have to hear about this.
Yeah, did you see that?
You're very brave.
Yeah,
yes.
I posted that today.
Yeah, I saw.
It's funny, yeah.
I'm on it. These are glaciers or holes in glaciers that have been photographed by very brave people, sort of essentially inching their way along a ladder and hovering above a big hole.
Yeah, so the one thing one
in the
cannot see,
ice.
the weakness in here is that these holes are most of them big enough to take a car. So it doesn't really show.
No, you'll have to go and look up that photograph because it's extraordinary.
Yeah, but
Very scary.
And it's called moulins. So all the conversations about the way that the glaciers are melting, and which has to do with they're kind of melting from the inside out to a large extent, and all these perforations, they have been there for there has been moulins at all times, but now they're just becoming bigger and bigger, and there's all that water, fresh water underneath the ice that sort of lifts the ice and all these things. So this is now. It's the photo of me making this photo. I look really young and handsome in the photo. So it's actually for 15, 14 years, I don't know, so a long time ago. But the thing is, you said one thing I thought we should maybe, before I drift down that climate discourse. Yeah, the whole thing about Icelandic landscape being monochrome, I thought that was interesting because I always thought,
I have some more slides about monochrome Icelandic.
yeah, that's a lovely museum in Denmark called Louisiana. The light in the ceiling here is in fact gray light. So all the lamps underneath or above this cloth, I wrapped it in gray filters to simply take some of the hue out. So when you walk in, it is first of all total shadowless. So that you have no indication of the fact that the shadow very often constitutes that there is a physical object. So it's an exercise of dematerialization, and you often have it in airports and places like this. You wonder, am I actually here? But so in a way, so it's a lovely exercise, and you know it from when you go to nature. And obviously, I then think of Iceland, but you have this gray. Totally white out sky.
We know about it here too.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So and then you have this interesting phenomenon where you are kind of in that zone of not being totally physically sure that you have. I mean, if you have a nice big fat South Italian shadow, like I'm so here, right?
Present, yes.
And then I can paint a Canaletto painting very easy, like it's all about this kind of way and so on. But here there's like both no colors, no shadow, dematerializing, generally speaking, and in this case it's a river bed which is just after spring, just after the winter has melted, snow melted, everything's gone. There's nothing left to melt, but there has been no seeds left to grow. Meaning there's also no birds to pick the small seeds, so that there's so silent, there's no shadows, the water's gone, and you just stand in this totally amazing space, a little bit fearful, oh maybe there's more water suddenly kind of all of a sudden, because it's a kind of a big river. It's in the area of Torsmark on the southern area. It's absolutely fantastic. So I said, I have to take this riverbed to Denmark. And it did actually, the museum they were so lovely, Louisiana said, okay, let's just take the whole riverbed in. So we took all these containers of rocks, and these are just type of the rocks. I mean, if these rocks were birds in Britain, they would be sparrows, like totally everywhere on every street out of the city and so on. Was that a strange with the
Well,
sparrow?
it's-
But
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
it's like, I wanted to say
we're
like
walking on
totally
sparrows?
normal.
Okay.
No, the sparrow
Common.
needs credit. But so this is a riverbed, but it has a lot to do with the monochromatic, the space, the idea of the what do we see when we take and deprive a picture or a narrative from color. And the point is, we see something different, or we see more, or we see a dimension that we otherwise don't see. That's why, just to circle a bit about your great show here, is obviously that it's very much about seeing the things that we otherwise are blinded to see. So it's a very structural thing. It's not just some kind of esoteric exercise. It's about making the invisible visible.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and that's also a famous line that Jasper Johns always said that in painting his grey targets or his grey American flags. Those are things that we see in the everyday, we register them, we don't even see them. And he said, I want to make them objects again, I want you to be kind of confronted with this.
Yes.
And also, what you also said about room for one color and monochrome is that, you know, you suppress some of your other senses and then your other ones get heightened. So in room for one color, you get this kind of crazy hypervision. And in this space, I imagine, you're walking around, all of a sudden you're hearing a lot. It's silent, and then you start walking on these stones, and the kind of crunching.
Yes.
Having recently crunched along similar stones, it must be,
Yeah, I think
it must sound like a racket in the middle of a gallery.
In what I guess is called motoric psychology, or it's a motoric something with the brain. The thing is that being destabilized to the extent of having to recompose your body to not fall, so it's almost biological. I guess it is biological. Then you become very active, and in that process, your senses starts to go into a degree of alert mode until you are more relaxed and used to walk on stones. Then you are alert. And there is this moment where you are alert, and that is a stress indicator for the body, and that creates a bit more.
Does it give you adrenaline as well?
Yeah, but it's adrenaline, but also the stress hormone that is not really good for you. Cortisol, right?
Yep,
yeah. So you have cortisol, right? And the cortisol makes your skin also arouse, and you become more. You don't necessarily, but you become more vapor. You breathe. The skin starts to breathe, and you become.
You're kind of more receptive as well.
And then it only sometimes just takes a few minutes, and then it's not so difficult. I'll just walk on the flat stones. Then you kind of calm down again. And this, I think, is a little bit like fact checking, right? It's just like revisiting. Okay, check senses, check balance, check. So when we walk down the sidewalk, we underestimate how much potential we have. Because we're also busy, which is fair enough. I mean, we can't fact check all the time, but sometimes it's kind of good to say, okay, I'm actually an organism with which really have incredibly sensitive, a register, which on the general, daily it's on the numified account, right? I'm kind of, because just also not to get too stressed, right? So I go on my numified. So now we have a situation, how do I take people into the museum and denumify them?
I like that word,
we could also say mummified, but denummified, and make them less numb. And obviously we bring these nummifying gadgets into the museum, like the Instagram account, right? Because it's where, and now we know. So I'm just saying it's complex. It's a lovely challenge.
I think, and this is the feedback I've been getting for people walking into all these monochrome spaces downstairs, and they're saying how much harder they feel like they need to work. They're really thinking about the artworks in a different sort of way. They're wondering why it was painted in a certain way, or how the artist was able to kind of compose light and shadow or narrative without color and all of that. And it reminds me of, there's a very famous art critic called Leo Steinberg, and when he looked at Jasper Johns' grey paintings, for example, he says, in these, seeing becomes thinking. And there's a lot of narratives around black and white painting about how intellectual it is. It sort of activates the mind in a different sort of way. It's sort of, you're shifted because you're used to color in the everyday, and suddenly you're looking at something that is not of the everyday. And it's sort of, it is that sort of discombobulating moment where you're like, oh, I have to readjust, I have to think about what I'm looking at.
And it is,
much more.
And looking at art, I'm sorry to say, it is often hard work. It just is. It's just not like if you want to relax, you can go to bloody Harvey Nichols, right? If you go into a museum, it's just not the same, right? And it shouldn't be the same. So I'm saying that but we just need to comfort the visitor and not say hard work. So I'm very interested in how do we
engage?
Yeah, what type of liberating concept can we come with so they think, oh, it's great to work really hard, right? And because there's
a welcome challenge.
I think what is perceived as work is the discrepancy between what is affirmative comfortable, right? Looking at the same colorful painting in every single gallery, and now there's like one without color, and I go, my God, that's hard work, right? And obviously we need to train and support people in understanding. Well, this is incredibly liberating. Now you can see more. It's like a win-win probably, but at least a win situation, because you can see something which you did not see otherwise.
And I think artists they must have struggled. In the earliest artists we look at in the exhibition, the Cistercians in the 12th century setting these poor artists this task of decorating a Cistercian monastery without any color, and they're like, how am I going to do stained glass windows without color? What about my illuminated manuscripts? What about these tiles? Yes. And then they rise to the challenge, and we've tried to do this throughout the whole exhibition of artists rising to that challenge and coming up with really extraordinary, innovative new techniques, inventing pen painting, inventing the monochrome oil sketch, all these challenges that they set for themselves.
And I'm still surfing on their waves, right?
Correct. And what we try and do is actually show how artists are surfing that wave. I didn't put it as eloquently as Oliver though. Totally. Speaking of waves, do you want to say anything about, because now that I've seen your Iceland series of photographs and been there, there's a waterfall around every corner. When you do waterfalls in the middle of New York or Brooklyn, do you want to say anything about these?
Yeah, but I can just connect maybe some of the dots. So urban space, like a private public space, does like, fair enough, Britain is like the most New York space in Europe, right? So when the private sector is done taking everything which is nice, what is left is the public sector. So until Mayor Bloomberg took that up as an agenda and said we need to reclaim public sector and give us space back to the people. So in that big program, right? So it's very much about London, very much about how Livingstone and so on. So it's a big European thing. Also turning the cities back to what is perceived now as being an asset side, which is the water and so on. So in that bigger scheme, and obviously it's complex because there's a lot of interesting interests being thrown around in that, as we all know. But in that bigger scheme, I spoke to Mayor Bloomberg, and I thought he was actually quite brilliant, because he said, I believe in art. Art has to be everywhere. Art is for everyone, and so on. So to have a mayor who was like totally and utterly behind. And of course, he had the benefit of having a bit of money himself. Once the city cash ran short on art, he would pitch in a little bit himself, which I think he deserves great credit for. So the situation here was, I was hoping to create a space in public space which would host the opportunity for people to find and see themselves in the listening sense that I was talking about before. So without going too long into that, I do think when we look at a waterfall, something very interesting happens, is that by seeing the speed of the water falling, you actually see how far away it is. And that is a measure, it's a scaling measure, which also is used in architecture.
Time element
you see
again.
Time passing simply. And if you do that, you also see a space with depth in which I have a body. So a waterfall is almost like a presencing machine. It makes me present. It says, my God, I exist, right? And this is so liberating, because we all doubt every here and there, do I actually, do I exist? Is it worthwhile? Should I stop making art and all of this? Then you see a waterfall and say, oh, it's all going to be fine. So that was what the project was about.
It'll be fine. I think we've got not very much time, but I think there's quite a few slides. So there might be other things you want to talk about. I remember seeing this for the first time and just being absolutely mesmerized. This shimmering, almost ghostly, spectral effect of the mist and the light and the water. And then as you move, you sometimes see rainbows and then they disappear and this sort of thing. You could spend all day in this space. The photographs don't do it justice.
Yeah, it's lovely, right?
And then, talented man. But you did an earlier one that was like this, that was actually called Beauty, that preceded this one.
Yeah, so sometimes, so that's true. I did a small one of Beauty, and I couldn't afford doing the big one. Now I can afford to do a big one.
Now you do a bigger one. But it's the same idea.
But this is more architecture. It's a big space. It's a round thing. You have to go through the water to get into it. The small one was more an intimate thing. This can actually have a group of people and does different things to different people and so on. It's an ephemeral thing which encourages people to focus on the kind of ephemeral. Ephemera has this potential that you without thinking about it, believe that if I don't look, it's probably not there. So a chair, you kind of know, okay, it's still somehow there. But a rainbow, I mean, the rainbow is the light, drop, eye. I mean, if you take away the eye, there's like nowhere for the rainbow to go. And this means it kind of has that other way of saying, if you look, you are a co-producer. You kind of make the rainbow. You look the other way, it's just some fluffy color science stuff. But so I think the kind of idea of taking ephemera into the space which is normally governed by objecthood, fetishism, art market, right? Galleries, art fairs, freeze. So suddenly we can say, okay, let's take something which is about non-quantifiability, negotiability, relativity, things that are hard to put on an auction. It's not about Sotheby's.
Yeah.
So in a way, I think it's very interesting to encourage people to say, well, first of all, I'm important. I can make a rainbow. What? Just look, rainbow. Secondly, the things that appears to be non-quantifiable can still be success criteria. And essentially, looking at a painting is the same. You just need to take that little bit of work and look, and then you need to find the painting that holds your story, right? But I do think a lot of paintings they just need to be dug out a bit.
And the onus is on you to dig those out.
But that is you being the curator here is obviously one of the people who are nurturing that intimate relationship, and very successfully in the show that you have made. Why can't you have a lot of pictures?
These were sent to me by someone in your studio. You have said about these sort of carving out icebergs and glaciers and transporting them around the world, and really making people think about what's happening elsewhere, and the best way to do that is to show them, for them to have something to touch, something else in their mind.
Yeah, it's the balancing between thinking and doing, and thinking and touching. I mean, we have enough data, right? We have the IPCC report that the UN did about the climate. There's a new one coming out soon, right? So all the politicians met in Paris, or they meet all the time anyway, and then they talk and they come with data, and the papers, they show us text, and we do need that too, right? We need data and science and so on. So that's not what I'm saying. But it appears to be incredibly disembodied, and because it's so disembodied, it's very hard to turn data into action, because where does the data sit? It sits in the brain, but it's not very close to the motoric cortex, right? Because my arm moves here, and the brain knowledge about the climate somehow sits in a different place. So if I could kind of connect the motoric, like doing, action, and participatory systems into the knowing system, it's funny that because there's one area of the brain that is very closely active, very closely located to the motoric activity. It's the part of the brain that is used for music. So apparently that is why we dance, because then that part of the brain is like literally next door to the, and then when we hear music, it's just like a spillover from the, and this is actually a serious theory, but so the idea is that people, they walk up to the ice. This is in Paris during the Paris treatment. They walk up to the ice and say, oh great, it's ice, and they say, oh, it's cold. And interestingly, they just, it's really, you can just tell that part of the brain and that part of the brain, they just did like this.
In a whole new
and
way.
They knew it was cold, but that was data knowledge, and holding hands with ice and all of that. And so it was about, how do I turn the climate report into something tangible in 2 seconds? And obviously there's a lot more to it. It was also funded by the great, now not mayor anymore, Mr. Bloomberg, and a Danish foundation called Realdania, within the program of Mayors Initiative, with whom I'm a little bit associated. So all the mayors of the big cities of the world, I believe, have more relevance in the future than the heads of states. Right? Different discussion. It's just
so we come back to that. We don't have much time, but I thought this installation would be really great to discuss, because it's all. There are two slides that show this. You were just talking about the white cube, different ideas about lighting and how you experience space under different lighting. If you could tell us just a couple things about what kind of lights you used here. Maybe not technically, but what you were trying to get people to think about.
Yeah, so one screen is actually daylight from the outside of the museum, because there is a big skylight. It's in Lund, it's in Malmö in Sweden, and a very beautiful Kunsthall. Yeah, so, and the other one, I closed the skylight and I put in artificial light, and I played you know, in the internet you can download light data about light, and you can play. I could download like the light in Florence, for instance. I could say, okay, now I play the light in Florence here, and with some tolerance and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's interesting to see that, for instance, Kandinsky traveled from Stockholm down to Denmark, to Hamburg, through Germany down to Italy, and obviously the perception of color changed all along, which is very much what your show is about. Light and color and so on is totally relative. So this is very much about my interest, long-time interest in how is light influences the perception of light, the fact that daylight is like a lot of different things, and how also you know, there is a lot of new studies on the so-called circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is how our body fluids of all sorts are interacting with the fact that you are exposed to light or not exposed to light. So if you go to Iceland soon, which I recommend, you should be careful not to get depressed because there's not a lot of light. And just that is actually a chemical thing. It's not just in your head. It kind of is in your head, but it's still chemical. And the thing is, and you know, the Nobel Prize was given to circadian researchers, antidepressives, for medicine.
And you could get those special lights,
just this year. So I'm like kind of totally on the sort of Nobel track here.
Clearly.
No, I was so happy because I worked on this for 10 years, and obviously they don't know me, but I'm like kind of yes. I've been saying this a long time. So this is actually about that, and that's why again there's nothing in there, because then people just look at that. And luckily the architecture is not so bad, so they can.
And the lights would change over a course of.
Yeah. So the daylight obviously changes because the day changes, and then the other light also very softly changes. It's not blinking; it's just very mellow, very going up and down. And
so you might get a warmer, a cooler.
Yeah, I didn't say to people that this is now Florence, but then they just get distracted. But they just go like, "My God, this is great! This light, I love this light."
You need patience, I think. You're getting people to slow down a lot in this, to kind of notice the nuance between the changing light and what is a brighter blue light or a cooler light or. Yeah.
So I have a light lab in the basement of my studio, sort of goes up and down a bit. So I work a lot with that.
I don't think we have time to do all of these, but this is good. Do you want me to go back?
This is the Kandinsky paintings I was talking about.
I thought this would relate quite nicely.
These, not exactly these paintings, but some of these paintings was made on that journey. It's very famous. Kandinsky took that journey and so on and so forth, and he even talked about synesthesia and light and so on. So I in Lembach House installed the light from the journey he did from Northern Europe to Southern Europe. So that's the same painting. Do you see how the same painting? This is Stockholm where he started, and this is, I think he went to Palermo. And maybe I mean, obviously it's
Sicilian
hard to see.
Light.
I'm not sure exactly what to be told, just to be a little scientific also. But he went, I think maybe it was Rome. But point is, it just shows that same painting, and they took, I think, 8 minutes for me to fade from one to the other.
So one could stand in front of there and experience all the.
Yes,
this is what curators think a lot about this, and we work with lighting designers, and we were talking about this in the exhibition.
In front of a painting.
Yes,
you should try to stay 8 minutes. It's really long, and it's great. It's fantastic.
8 minutes. Oh, I would have loved to have seen. Okay, we're fast forwarding.
Oh, here we are.
Here we are. You have to quickly say something about this.
So the thing is, and even though there's not a lot of strong science proving it, we tend to see more in monochromatic light simply because we process less information. And that is well established. That's why shooting glasses are yellow and driving and snow glasses, and you don't get snow blind. I mean, there's lots of reasons. The Swiss tunnel traffic management says you detect red rear lights faster in a monochromatic tunnel and brakes, and there's less accidents. Right? So it's actually it's a quantifiable measure to see more. And it has a stronger response system. You also, as if I understand it right, and now you are the specialist, so I'm a little more careful than usual. But
yes, I'm the specialist on the stage. And
no, so apparently we can detect more gray zones or gray nuances in a color photo, in a black and white photo than the same photo. Yeah, so we see a lot more nuances in a sort of photo of the sky with the clouds. We can see a lot more sort of definition than in a color photo, and I think this idea of coming into a space which is empty, in which you see more, obviously forces you to look at each other. And this means you become the subject in this painting. And I think there's a retroactive potential for the show in terms of you thinking, oh, maybe it was also me in the other painting. You know, maybe I'm reconstituting the seeing contract. I propose, right? So I go like, maybe I'm, you know, I at least offer the opportunity for kind of projecting the construction of the narrative between you and a painting in a as I said before, you can turn the perspective. You could actually exercise the notion that the painting is in fact seeing you, and the shape of what's going on the painting is a projection of what the artist was expecting you to think. So there's a lot of stuff going the other way. It's not just you, right? So this is so interesting, and the reason why I'm interested in focusing or maybe deconstructing the fact that seeing is a lot more culture than nature. I believe that seeing is culture. It's relative to our cultural context, even though I was sort of on the biological side before. I'm very interested in the potential, because then we can also start to renegotiate everything else. I mean, if the world is relative, it is likely to change if we engage. If it is totally non-relative, it is less likely to respond should we have an opinion about something. So it has great importance to at least believe or give people the impression that what they say matters. So a room like that is a really kind of a world connector. It makes you think, oh, the way I see the world, maybe it's just a construction. And maybe reality is not real. Maybe reality is something I have to make myself. It's not a dogma that I mean, and I know for a lot of people reality is very real because they are not in a situation where it's very negotiable. So I'm not trying to be arrogant. But I mean, think about it. Church painting, art history, and churches, isn't that so? They were made white, right? What is it? Lehm in German? Chalk.
Yeah.
So you made the white paint, right? Now it gets late. The white paint. Why did the hospitals in Venice, right? That leopard island. They were throwing the white chalk everywhere because it was bacterially good. It was good. You put it on wounds. So purification of wounds and the leopard stage was white because it was purifying the bacterial management and all of that. That's why the church, they said, we better make it white, right? There's all these horribly dirty people in this beautiful building. So white was really just a kind of a practical measure. And then, of course, all the modernists came, Mies and so on, and they said, oh, we have to purify it now. Architect, all this over-decorated junk coming out of the Victorians and all that. We will make it white because it was about purification. It was about cleaning up the way we see the world, right? And then so on. And then there was the white. And then there's the bloody white cube, right? I mean, it's the same, right? So all the galleries are white. So the French kind of salons, they took the wallpaper down and started painting it white. We had Bauhaus or so. So what if chalk would have been yellow in the beginning, right? It's just like, then all the galleries, all the museums would be yellow and so on.
Would be the yellow cube.
So it would have been, so I'm just saying, so color is really something which is a lot more negotiable than what we mistakenly think.
So effectively, part of what you're saying, I think, is you become hyper aware of your own perception in this space, that you have been going around through the world bringing your own perception to everything you encounter, not just every artwork that you've just encountered in the exhibition itself, but to maybe everyone that you meet, all these kind of expectations that you bring to everything in the everyday. All of the works, I think, in the exhibition sort of subvert that or throw it on its head a little bit. You're like, oh, this isn't what I expected, or this is François Boucher in black and white, that's not what I expected, stained glass in black and white. This room, it does give you that sense of hypervision. I looked at people I know really, really well in that space, and I noticed things about the shape of their face and their eyes. And what it also does, and we talked about this briefly, all the security guards have mentioned to me that everyone goes very quietly through the entire exhibition. And they were telling me that people enter the space and all of a sudden this noise erupts and people are giggling and laughing and chatting and taking photographs and exchanging and having that kind of experience. This invites that kind of interactivity, that kind of self-reflection that you talk about.
It addresses the somatic knowledge, sort of somatic experience, somatic knowledge. So it's a physical, even though it's clearly going through the eyes, of course, but it's a very physical experience to be showered in light like this. So this, I think, causes people to, especially kids, who are not burdened with all that behavioral stuff. So kids, they immediately just start to go like this. And so interesting, you put a kid in there, and then they just, so because the stimulus, it's obviously it's perceived through cognition, but it is still very much a physical thing, because I have also deprived it from a controlling narrative. I could have put in funny shapes on the walls, oh look how they change, and then it would be, okay, I'm seeing something over there, but now I'm the funny shape. And that is what I mean. That is what I mean about trust. And I'm not sure one should only have this, because then, of course, it's about that data action balance, I think. And should you bother to find out, you can look up. But I'm very curious about, we can assist this experience by telling people what's going on, which is great, and people can take it through their kind of more learning-driven engagement. But we can also allow them to be foolish. For a little while. I mean, by the time they get out of that show, then they will see, okay, stop being foolish. And it's just interesting to host people's desire to be foolish, la folie, right? Just like in garden architecture, the fool, the pavilion, right? The foolish pavilion. So I'm happy in this excellent show here to be this sort of little foolish, a little bit of foolishness, to fool around.
We invite you to fool around in Oliver's space. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us, for this amazing love.
Thank you.
Thank you.